is the second part about this is our second part of our weekly Q&A, where we will be covering all things social studies related, history, things like that. So whatever questions you have that you want to ask social science related, be sure to drop it in the chat, and we will be getting to it in a timely fashion as much as possible. I'm happy to announce that these live streams have become quite successful, and we've had some really, really great people around. And even with the trolls, we're having some fun. So it's been really enjoyable. And we are actually shifting. We are going to start having three live streams. We are going to fill up your weekend with live streams. One of them will be where I talk about social sciences and social studies and different topics that are upon my mind, such as what I wanted to talk about today, which I'll probably get to. And then we will be doing that on Friday evenings, and at probably like 9 o'clock Eastern time. Way to start your weekend, get your weekend started with a little bit of social sciences and a little bit of history. Thank you for liking. If you want to be a friendly neighborhood historian, you can like and subscribe, and that makes you a friendly neighborhood historian. We are trying to hit 6,000 subscribers by the end of the year. We are well over 5,000 thanks to all of your guys' support. And my wonderful moderator, Simon the Bunny, is there. We are not 10 minutes late. I will never cancel one even if I'm sick. But we are just a couple minutes late. We don't try to be normally that late. But hello, welcome. Thank you for joining us. So yeah, liking and subscribing. It's that easy to become a friendly neighborhood historian. And we are adding a third live stream. That's the big news today. We will be doing it Friday nights, either like 8 Eastern, 9 Eastern, something like that, Eastern Standard Time. So like very late in the UK and Israel and Cairo and all those places, and very late in India and China. But we've got people from all over the world who come into these live streams and ask really great questions and want to talk about history. And usually we get people from different countries, and they want to know if I, obviously an American, know anything about their history. And they're surprised sometimes to find out that I do, but I learn a lot from them, and thanks to them. So yeah, so we'll probably get some trolls, but it'll be an enjoyable live stream that you guys can. That'll be the first part of the Q&A, and then the second part of the Q&A will be Saturdays at 6, which I am probably going to shift to early Saturday evenings as well in a couple of weeks, and then Sundays, or later in the evening, I should say. Sundays will be at the same time, 1 o'clock Pacific time, 4 o'clock Eastern, 3 o'clock Central, 2 o'clock Mountain time. So we have a bunch of topics we're going to get to today. If you are just joining us, this is the Friendly Neighborhood History Channel, and the second part of our weekly live Q&A, where we talk about social studies, history, social sciences, anything you guys are interested in. If you have a topic you want to learn more about or want me to talk about, just drop it in the chat and I will get to it. If you have a question about social studies, ask it. My wonderful moderator will most likely be putting the social media handles for the Friendly Neighborhood History Channel in the chat. So if you want to follow the channel on Instagram, on X, on Facebook, be sure to do. We had a really fun live stream yesterday that was a little bit more political science based, but I think was really enjoyable. Some people were telling me afterwards that it went really well, and I really appreciate everyone's support. So if you want to support, if you want to learn more about history and social sciences, and you want to be a friendly neighborhood historian, it's as easy as liking and subscribing. So if you like and subscribe, that's it. You don't have to give me any money. You don't have to send me a weekly donation. You don't have to do any of those things. You don't have to sign up for my Patreon. I don't have a Patreon yet. All you have to do is like and subscribe, and then you are officially a friendly neighborhood historian. So if you have any historical topics you would like to bring up in the chat, please drop them in there now. I'm going to check and look at the chat right now and see if we have any topics, questions already. And if we don't, then I have a few topics that I would like to talk to you about. And Simon has he's my wonderful moderator, always here, always faithful, always loyal. He has put the social media handles in the chat, so you guys can follow me there on different platforms, Facebook, X, and Instagram. And I also should probably put my email in there in case you want to directly contact me. I am also taking suggestions, probably through email would be best, about potential topics in the future. Usually I pick the topics, but if you guys have particular historical topics you would like me to talk about at the beginning of my live streams, I'd be happy to do it. You just tell me what it is and we'll get to it. And so I've already got a couple. Yeah, Joe is asking something interesting. So I did a video recently. I do a daily Born Today video. I do a daily Rest in Peace video if someone passes away on a particular day, someone historically important. And I do a daily Today in History video, like what happened on this day in history. So one of the videos I did was about Che Guevara, the Latin American revolutionary who fought for Cuban independence with Fidel Castro and helped overthrow the Batista government, then went to Central and South America and was eventually hunted down and killed in Bolivia, with basically Castro letting it happen. Very interesting kind of political dynamics in communism in Latin America. Guevara and the Cubans also tried very hard to spread communism in Africa with really no tacit approval or support from the Soviet Union. They kind of did that on their own to spread communism. But eventually he was hunted down by the Bolivians who were working with the CIA, and Castro was well aware of it, but he didn't really say anything. And so the Bolivian military was able to hunt down Guevara. He was hiding hiding out in the Andes, and he was arrested and eventually killed. And so one of my wonderful people, Joe Schmo, was mentioning that was saying he was a brutal man who murdered a lot of people, and this is absolutely true. Guevara is very popular in the United States amongst more revolutionary types. People love to put him on their shirts. He's popular. You see him at rallies for unions. He's seen as as someone who stands up for workers. He's seen as handsome and photogenic and somebody who people would like to emulate. And that's definitely not the full historical picture of who he was, despite him fighting for what he believed was the right thing. That doesn't mean that he didn't right things in order to achieve that freedom. I did compare him to George Washington in a recent comment by Joe on one of the videos I made about Che Guevara on the anniversary of his death. And I said that Che Guevara was basically I was not saying that Che Guevara was like George Washington, but how do we distinguish as historians between people like George Washington as opposed to Che Guevara? How do we see the difference between those two men? And so that was something that I thought was very interesting. I think that Guevara was obviously very dangerous and did a lot of terrible things. But Washington killed a lot of people. Washington owned slaves. So how do we distinguish and understand them? I think that's a huge historical complex. And I think you look at the results of what they do, and that's eventually how you determine, is this person more on the historical villainy side, or are they more on the historical hero side? If there even is a side of historical heroism and villainy. In history doesn't necessarily. History is just a list of objective facts. Or if you want to go with Napoleon's view, it's a fable that we all agree upon. History is bunk. That's what Henry Ford said. I don't want to say that. I don't want to go that far. I know that some history is doctored and altered and written by the victors, and that's absolutely true, and we can't ignore that as historians. And you guys, as the Friendly Neighborhood historians, if you like and subscribe, that makes you a Friendly Neighborhood historian. You guys certainly can't ignore that people are complex and they do a lot of good and a lot of evil. So the truth of the matter is, I wouldn't say that Che Guevara is like George Washington, other than the fact that they were both freedom fighters who wanted independence and liberty. They obviously believed in very different ways and means of getting there, and very different results came from their work. So I don't think that there was indiscriminate killing on Washington's approval. In fact, when the American army wanted to torture British spies in order to get out answers, what we would call nowadays, to be politically correct, enhanced interrogation techniques, Washington forbade the idea because he thought it was an awful thing to do. He didn't want to stoop to their level, even though the British were capturing and torturing American soldiers. He felt that that was the absolute wrong thing to do. Guevara did not hesitate to torture people. So things like that. So yeah, Joe, that's me clarifying my position on it. I definitely don't think that George Washington and Che Guevara are on the same wavelength. I think they have a couple of similarities that just are happenstance, like they're soldiers, they're fighting for freedom of their people, whatever you want to say. But at the same time, I also would like to say that when you really look at it, we as historians have to analyze what are the differences between these historical figures. How do they have a particular historical impact, and how do we judge them, and how will history judge them? And we can't be blind to Che Guevara's good traits, and we can't be blind to Washington's bad ones. So I hope that clears that up for you, Joe. If you're just joining us, this is the Friendly Neighborhood History Channel, the second part of our weekly Q&A. We will be doing, starting next week most likely, a Friday and Saturday instead of a Saturday-Sunday. And Sunday will be me kind of talking about whatever topic I want to bring about. So there'll be 3 live streams next weekend. We are also considering going live on different platforms as well, maybe on Sundays. So if you guys like learning about social sciences, you like learning about history, like and subscribe. Follow me on the social media handles and the pinned chat comment from my wonderful moderator, Simon the Bunny. And you guys are a Friendly Neighborhood historian. It's as easy as that. You don't have to give me any money or sign up for anything. But if you have any historical topics you would like to talk about or ask me about, that's what this is for. This is where I give back to you by answering your wonderful questions. Just drop those questions in the chat, and I will be sure to get to them in a timely manner. I'm going kind of down the list. And I got a great question from Joe about Che Guevara and George Washington. Trivgum was asking, what was the significance of the defenestration of Eriksgata in shaping Swedish succession laws in the late 13th century? That's very specific, and I don't know about that. A defenestration is where you throw someone out a window. If I am correct, Sweden at one point in its history was electing its monarchs, and then in the late 1200s, early 1300s, they started, the king set up, one of the kings, I think it was Gustav I, set up a hereditary line that would rule Sweden for centuries to come. So they at first had kind of elected their kings. Their nobles elected their kings in Sweden, and eventually they set up a hereditary line similar to other European kingdoms such as France and England. So that's kind of all I know there. But I need to really read more about that. The defenestration of Eric Scotta. That just sounds like the name of a Star Wars episode. But yes, I'll definitely look at that. Hola, gracias. Bienvenidos, Anonymous Hunter Team. From Spain. Wonderful. Great to have you. You probably figured it out. I am an American. I do not give my actual information of where I am in the United States. I can give you a hint by saying that all of my live streams are always posted with the comment that it is Eastern Standard Time. People have been guessing for a long time, and I will never tell. But thank you for joining us, and if you like learning about history, if you like asking about historical topics, be sure to like and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow, and you are officially a Friendly Neighborhood Historian. And drop any social science-related topic you want in the chat or a question for me, and I'll be sure to answer it in a timely manner. Hello, welcome. Hello. Israel loves the USA. Well, that's definitely true, and the USA loves Israel, for better or for worse. Oh yeah, where am I? Yes, Simon's bringing up on this day, 2011, former Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi was killed during the Libyan civil war, making a significant moment in the Arab Spring and the ongoing conflict in Libya. Yes, that did happen today, and I covered it in my Rest in Peace videos because we had him dying today. I'm going to cover the Arab Spring a little bit more. That's a great topic for a future live stream. Remember, my live streams will be 3-parters from now on. Friday and Saturday we'll do a live Q&A, and then Sundays we're going to be talking about topics that I want to talk about, so it won't be a Q&A, but you will still get Q&As Friday and Saturday nights, and then just friendly neighborhood history from me on Sunday afternoons. So, anyways, yes, Gaddafi, that happened today. The Battle of Shiagaka happened today, where the Tokugawa shogunate was able to start controlling Japan. There's a bunch of incredibly important events that happened today. The U.S. Senate approved the Louisiana Purchase, Thomas Jefferson's big land grab that doubled the size of the United States, buying lands from Napoleon, who wanted to use the money to fund an army that could invade Britain. So there's some stuff going on there. There's a lot. You guys, hopefully, if you like and subscribe and check out the content, I do Today in History videos at least once a day, one of them a day, because there's a lot going on, and you'll see that later in the video where I'll go into more detail. So. Let's see here. Hello. Welcome, Running Man. Good to see you again. Thank you for subscribing. I really appreciate that. Hello welcome from Uzbekistan. That's really awesome. I love what do you think of Sinwar? Sinwar. Somebody needs to jog my memory on who Sinwar is, and then I can tell you, because the name sounds eerily familiar. Amos is asking, Amos, one of my wonderful people who's always here, thank you so much for joining us again. What was the most significant time in man's history? Oh, my goodness gracious. That's such a difficult one, because that's like one of those very broad, like, what's your favorite type of history? It's usually the history I'm learning about right now. And if you like learning about history, if you're just joining us, welcome to our live Q&A. Like and subscribe. Join the Friendly Neighborhood Historians. We are trying to get to a legion, 6,000 Friendly Neighborhood Historian subscribers by the end of the year. But yeah, there are many significant times in man's history. I think that that if I want to go real ancient, I would say the Neolithic era, where you have the Green Revolution, the end of the Mesolithic era, and the development of human settlements because of farming. Because of this Green Revolution, all of a sudden humans are starting to band together and live together. They're no longer kind of roving around in itinerant nomadic groups. And that eventually will lead to the development of settlements. These farms will need tools will need stones will need quarries, people will need to guard the farms, and people will need to pray to the gods to get good rain. And so you see the development of social stratification and social classes and hierarchy in these settlements that eventually grow into what we call towns and cities. And cities in the ancient world, especially back then, early, in places like Africa and Sumer and North America and places like that, and China and Egypt were not that big comparatively. You take a city like New York City, the biggest city in the United States with 8 million people, no city was getting anywhere close to that. However, it is very likely that I think that time was just such a huge period of development of cities, of towns, and humanity changed so much. You have social stratification, you have the development of religion, you have a development of the earliest religions like Hinduism and later Judaism in the Fertile Crescent. You have a development of Sumerian culture, which is really the first organized civilization most people learn about because they live in cities and write, which for many historians is the technical beginning of history. Everything before that is prehistory. So I think that Neolithic and Mesolithic era is extremely important between 10,000 and 2000 BC. So that would be my answer about what is the most important, significant time in man's history. I know that's surprising. A lot of people would think it's now. We're seeing rapid technological development. Now is this period, contemporary history, the last 30 years, is giving that Mesolithic, Neolithic era a run for its money. And of course, it's in a much shorter time. But I think the development of human society, classes, uh, gender roles, religious and political structures that we're still dealing with, wrestling with, and struggling with today happens at that period. So it's quintessential to history because it's when people got to cities and they started to write, and that's when you get this technical start of history and the end of prehistory. Interestingly enough, a lot of historians and archaeologists and anthropologists, when they study ancient ruins, ancient tablets like from Sumerian, Egyptian, ancient Babylonian, Chinese culture, papyrus, stuff like that, they've always expected, ooh, we'll find out who was the king and who did this and that. And sometimes they find that out, but a lot of times, like the earliest clay tablets, cuneiform, from the Sumerians, that wasn't writing about their emperors or their gods or their social classes. It was business transactions. It was business ledgers, because trade was important even before there was history and even as history got started. So, Amos, that's a great question. I really appreciate that. And if you have a question you want to talk about, please drop it in the chat and I will get to it at a timely manner. Hello, welcome, Samson. So good to see you. Hello, welcome. Finish him. Also, Dracula. Today is the birthday of the first Dracula, Bela Lugosi. So happy birthday to Bela Lugosi. We're getting close to Halloween. I thought it was very appropriate to do a video about him. Thank you, Samson, for coming from India. So good to see you. Yes. Oh, yes. Sinwar. So that's really contemporary. I believe he was identified and killed just a couple of days ago. And there's a lot of indications that the war in Gaza is shifting from the focus on the Hamas and the Palestinians to being an all-out war between Israel and all of the terrorist satellites and its main sponsor, Iran. And that could lead to a world war, and that's a huge concern for people. A lot of people think that now is the time to end the war, now that Sinwar is dead. Thank you for reminding me who he was. I do talk about geopolitics, but I try to do it as objectively and fairly as possible. I try not to get too political. I don't try to give my opinion that much, except from a strategic standpoint. We did that a little bit yesterday, talking about the 2024 presidential election in the United States, which is obviously on everyone's mind, and will be for the next 3 weeks at least. Yes, Sanja, I am teaching history. That's what I do. This is the Friendly Neighborhood History channel. If you like and subscribe, you are a friendly neighborhood historian. Global solidarity, where is that? Because that is not fair. History does not start when white people or any certain visitors, settlers, colonizers, whatever you want to call them, show up. History begins before that. There is sustained contact and records in many parts of North and Central and South America, but there was plenty of things written down and built and discovered of those ancient peoples. And their technology may not have been on par with the Europeans, but they had a developed culture and society long before any white men ever showed up. Yeah, I'm very interested in where you're talking about, Global. Yeah, I wouldn't say that. I would say that civilization already was just around, starts with the writing and development of culture, and you already had social stratification beginning, where you can see people who are making and producing a lot, getting a lot of money, and you can see people who are being a higher status and people who are not like that being lower along the totem pole. And welcome everyone who's just joined. This is a Friendly Neighborhood History channel, our weekly Q&A. Ask me anything about history, social science related. Like and subscribe if you enjoy learning about history. Ooh, what happened? Did the Durrington Wells Festival around 2500 BC have on social structures among Neolithic communities in southern Britain? I don't know enough about Neolithic communities in Europe. Most of the Neolithic communities I know about are Sumerian, Egyptian, Chinese, African. I don't know as much about European development, but I believe that leads to the formation of a Celtic society. Yes, and the average lifespan was very low. Thank you. You don't have to ask anything. You can just sit back and enjoy the ride. That's what we're here for. That's what we like to do. And I'm sorry, my lighting's really bad today. Let me see here. Hello, welcome. Thank you for joining us. Ooh, from Texas, welcome. Yes, I am into Norse history a little bit. I don't know as much about it, but the more I study England, the more I realize that England is the way it is, and was founded because of the Norse, because of the the Scandinavian peoples. And so anyone who is interested in European and English history and British history and by extension American history should be interested in the impact of Vikings and the Norse people on Europe as a whole, as well as England especially. So yeah, I am into that. Yo, welcome. Thank you for joining us, Mike. Hello, welcome. Thank you for joining us. Global, there is some truth to that because the Constitution there was the Iroquois Confederation, but the Constitution is based on a bunch of things. You have French philosophers from the Enlightenment period and their beliefs about government and what good government looks like. You also have the British system. You have the English Bill of Rights. You have the Magna Carta, which I talked about in a video yesterday. All of those things greatly influenced the American system and the creation of an American system. Montesquieu called for a separation of powers and free branches of the government. We talked about this yesterday in the live stream. You have Rousseau's idea of the will of the people. You have that creates the electoral system in America. But there is the Iroquois Nation and the Iroquois Confederacy, which is a confederation of 5 different native tribes, the Iroquois peoples, the most famous of them being the Mohawk tribe, which is where we get the hairstyle, the Mohawk. But they had their own conventions and elections and almost like a semi-democratic Republican system similar to America. And yes, they did inspire the American Constitution to some extent. You are absolutely right. And I think a good Did You Know video, I do Did You Know and historical myth videos all the time, would be Did you know that the American Constitution was partly inspired by the Iroquois Nation? So thank you for bringing that to my attention, Global. Ooh, Lemon's asking a really good one. What is your opinion on Christopher Columbus? Because we've been talking about him a lot because of Columbus Day last week, recent discoveries about his Jewish ethnicity and other things. What is my opinion about Columbus? Well, I think that it's a complex opinion, and I think anyone who looks at Columbus nowadays has to have a complex one. I think that Columbus Day, I probably have a more controversial opinion when I say that Columbus Day should be celebrated, not just because of Columbus, but because of recognizing Italian influence in America, the importance of the discovery of America, and how it did change the world for better or for worse, in many cases, for the natives worse, and for other people better. The world system is the way it is today because of Columbus. Better, and maybe someone else would have come around and discovered it. We don't know. All we know is that Columbus did discover it, and not discover in the sense that there were no people living here who didn't have their own civilizations that were wonderful, but discover in the sense that he created a permanent contact between the Western Hemisphere and the Eastern Hemisphere, and that took some feat. That was no small feat in any way, shape, or form, even if he was deceived into thinking he was in India. By the way, that is not why he called the people Indians. He called them Indians because he called them un gente, un Dios, a people in God. So I think that a lot of people have this whitewashed version of Columbus and have for centuries, where Columbus is this great guy who was brave and bold, and he did do some brave and bold things. And I think it's extremely important. And I think it's important to celebrate Columbus Day because of the history of Italian Americans and Spanish Americans and Jewish Americans. Now, as we discovered that Columbus was a Sephardic Jew from Spain who settled in Genoa. I think it's important to celebrate those contributions and celebrate the world, the system, the world that's been created to some extent or another, but also lamenting the awful atrocities that Columbus inflicted and others inflicted on the Native Americans. And I don't believe that Indigenous Peoples Day should replace Columbus Day because I believe that Indigenous Peoples Day is patronizing. I think Indigenous people need an Indigenous Peoples Month. And if you want to celebrate one particular day to highlight Indigenous peoples, which you can't say all the Native Americans are the same, that was the same mistake that whites made. You can pick one day, but it shouldn't be a day you're replacing to celebrate a colonizer like Columbus. So I think that Columbus has a mixed legacy. I think that the whitewashing is kind of over, and a lot of people are kind of just ditching him and dropping him away, except for kind of right-wingers who want to hold on to him like he's the best thing ever, and he isn't. So I think that you have to have a complex view about Columbus and not just trash him completely and not just praise him without question. I think you can praise some of the things he did while lamenting other ones. And I think this goes down to a basic lesson of economics. There is always a trade-off. He discovers a new land that will be influenced and share its culture with the Spanish and the Spanish with them. What's the result? They get enslaved and tons of diseases that kills off a huge number of natives. And we can't just ignore that or sit around. So, Lemon, great question. Columbus, obviously extremely controversial, and I hope I've given a solid enough answer there. Hello, John. Welcome. Thank you, Mike. I really appreciate that. Hello, Charlie. Well, good to see you again. Pihi is asking, what do you know about Flat Earth? All I know is that Flat Earth supporters The flat Earth theory has supporters all around the globe. Now let that sink in. I think it's bunk. And I think it's based on misreadings of ancient texts and misreadings of religious texts. And in connection to Columbus, a common historical myth that I've talked about on the channel before is the idea that Columbus set out to prove the world was round. No, that's not true. Columbus knew it was round. His sponsors, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, one of the most powerful royal couples in European, if not world history, knew it was round. Who, by the way, Ferdinand and Isabella, I said I wanted to talk about them on the live stream. Really important for the development of the Spanish Empire, for the settlement of the Americas and the creation of the modern world. They also, by the way, that royal power couple, it was Isabella who was the more powerful one. So if you look at ancient paintings not ancient, but early modern paintings of Columbus going to Ferdinand and Isabella, he's always talking to Isabella. He's always kissing her hand. He's always bowing to her because she controlled more of the land and she called the shots, not just in their marriage, but throughout Spain. And their marriage was the union, the creation of the beginning of the creation of a one Spanish state ruled by a king and queen. Although he ruled over Aragon and she ruled over Castile and Leon, eventually their descendants would rule over all of the land. So, such as King Charles V, and King Charles I, and Philip II, and other guys that are very famous in history. Anyways, sidebar is everybody knew Ferdinand and Isabella, the Pope, the Catholic Church, the Protestant reformers, Columbus, they knew the world was round. I mean, not only did they know, the ancient Greeks knew it was round, and we're talking about this. Archimedes proved that the earth was round hundreds of years before the birth of Christ. So I believe it's a theory that the idea that Columbus was trying to prove the earth was round is absurd. He knew it was round, or spherical, I should say, and he just underestimated how big it was. He thought that there was a Western Passage, and Europeans continued to think there was a quicker, easier way to get to India and China and Japan for centuries after Columbus. Columbus was nothing new with that. So, at the end of the day, I think it's a theory that doesn't hold any water, and I think that historically it's proven to be bunk because thousands of years ago people knew it was not true. Maybe people who were not educated were like, okay, maybe the earth is flat, and I get where they're coming from, and I understand that. There's not a lot of educational opportunities for poor peasants in France in the 1100s. But the scientific revolution did not prove that the earth was round to everybody because a lot of people already knew it. So, hello, welcome. Thank you for joining us. This is the Friendly Neighborhood History Channel. If you have any social studies like questions you would like to ask, drop them in the chat and I will get to them. We've got a lot of people here today, and it's so good to see all of you spending your Sunday afternoons, evenings, whatever, Monday mornings even, talking about history with me. So that I really appreciate that. If you love learning about history, ask anything you would like to, and also feel free to like and subscribe. That would make you a Friendly Neighborhood Historian officially. We are growing. We're trying to hit 6,000, so I can say we are a legion by the end of the year. So who built the pyramids? NN is asking. Who built the pyramids? Okay, so this is a big thing. I've heard a lot of different theories about this. The aliens theory, the giants theory. I think that the Egyptians built the pyramids. I know that sounds crazy. I don't know exactly how they did it. I think it took a lot of manpower, but the Egyptians were really good at using manpower, both hired and forced. And if you actually study the history closely, the Egyptian pharaohs would actually set up cities and towns for the people while they built these monuments to them. So this was a project that would take years. They built their whole lives around building these monuments and being in close proximity to it so that they could work for the pharaoh. So anyways, hello, welcome. Thank you for joining us. Robert is asking about the Boxer Rebellion. Yes, that's a very interesting conflict to learn about, and I think it's very deep, and I've been blessed just in the last couple of years, very grateful to be learning more about Eastern history, China and India and things like that. The Boxer Rebellion is obviously extremely important in the sense that it creates this, it highlights the tensions that were always present in the semi-occupational spheres of influence that the Europeans had in China. And basically the mother of the emperor believed that China had abandoned its old ways, and so she led them in a revolt. I forget exactly why they're called the Boxers, but basically all the great European powers and Japan and the United States kind of went in there to crush it so that they could continue to proliferate and profit off of trade with China, where they kind of dominated China's economic and political affairs, especially the British. But China was always kind of trying to throw out the foreign invaders, and rather than adapt so that they wouldn't be overtaken like the Japanese did in the Meiji Restoration. So basically, it was mainly Japan actually who sent in the most soldiers and put down the conflict. But basically, it was the Chinese showing that they did not want to be dominated by the Europeans, and it allowed the United States to create the open door policy, where basically instead of China just having different areas where the Russians would trade, the Germans, the French, and the British, they would all trade equally with the Chinese, kind of creating this free trade policy where China was still kind of profited off. The Qing dynasty, Qing, was in huge decline at this point. It was near the end of its time. The Chinese empire was collapsing, but China was also the victim of an extractive economy thanks to the British and the French and the other Europeans, particularly the British, who, in order to dull the population and created an illegal opium trading in the 1800s and fought and won 2 wars against the Chinese to continue their proliferation of opium throughout the country. So China had been, you look at the history books pre-1500, you look at history before then, and you will see that China is the real dominant superpower in the world. So is the Ottoman Empire. It's not the Europeans. The Europeans were not anywhere close. China could have easily discovered the New World. In the 15th century, there were these things called the treasure fleets, where Zheng He, working for the Ming Dynasty, would go from different islands and extract treasure from them in Micronesia and Polynesia. And they eventually stopped doing this, and it ended Chinese discovery. And as China continued to become more insular and looking to itself, especially with the Qing dynasty, it became weaker. Despite having the largest population and some of the biggest advancements, the Chinese were using gunpowder, paper, and money long before the Europeans ever even thought of it. So it's a fascinating thing to see how China kind of got bullied by the Europeans in the 19th century. And the Boxer Rebellion, Robert, was the effort of the Empress Dowager and the Chinese and the nationalist Chinese to end this. And the nationalist Chinese, although losing them, will eventually be successful because they're going to set up a government, starting a republic in the 1910s and 20s. They will eventually lose to the communists under Mao in 1949 after World War II. So Boxer Rebellion, extremely important, just highlights the antipathy towards imperialism felt by many conquered and subjected peoples. And if you like learning about the Boxer Rebellion and other historical events, please be sure to follow me, subscribe, all that good stuff. My social media stuff is in the chat. Thank you for those of you who are just joining us. This is the second part of our weekend doubleheader for the Friendly Neighborhood History Channel, live Q&A. Ask me anything social science related, history, politics, things like that. Drop it in the chat, and I will talk about it as objectively and fairly as I possibly can. Hello, welcome from Nepal. It's so great to see people from all over the world here. I don't know what that is, Teoman, but thank you for saying I'm well-spoken. Thank you, 16. I have a Coke for me. That's my favorite soft drink. Yeah, Trivgum, very good question about the destruction of Ur. Well, Uruk is supposedly the founder of the Sumerian culture, and so the destruction of the city of Ur was considered huge because Ur was the biggest city. Some of these cities would swell up to be as big as, like I said, these are small compared to modern cities, but would swell up to be 100,000 people, and that was a megapolis. That was the New York City, London, and Mexico City, and Paris and Beijing of the third millennium BC. In the second millennium BC. So the destruction of Ur, these ancient people did not understand, often saw consequences, even from direct warfare, as the punishment of the gods. And so the lamentation, I mean, there's a book in the Bible, for those of you who are familiar with the Judeo-Christian tradition, called Lamentations, that mourns the loss of Jerusalem. Interestingly enough, to a Sumerian people or Mesopotamian people, the Neo-Babylonian Empire under Nebuchadnezzar II, or Nebuchadnezzar the Great. So the destruction of Ur leads to this development of lamentation amongst a lot of the Sumerians, because Ur was kind of the where it all started, because of Uruk. And the city bore his name and was extremely important to him and to the Mesopotamian culture. I am from, yep. Oh, I love the Nepalese flag, by the way. How do you think, UFC is asking, how do you think the British history has been altered? I heard it isn't very accurate. I wouldn't say it's not inaccurate. I mean, this is what I was talking about earlier. So Napoleon said history is a fable we all agree upon. Henry Ford said history is bunk. A lot of people have pointed out that history is written by the victors, and therefore, what does that mean? When people say that, they just kind of leave it out there, and that's why I don't really like that phrase too much, because yes, history is written by the victors, and so that means we can't trust anything about history. There's no accurate history. There's no effort by the historian to be honest. I understand bias. I understand subjectivism. I understand that sometimes we learn revisionism happens of events. Sometimes we go back and learn something new. Sometimes we refine our view about somebody because of certain historical information that comes about or of certain events. And so I think there's been some altering of British history. But if you look at the victors write history, the British are the victors. And so, of course, they're going to write the history as being amazing. But the thing we've got that's going well for us in the last 2 centuries is the development, partly ironically, from education through the British system and through other imperial systems, France and the like, where people, and the United States has done this too, where people from developing world and periphery countries can come and learn and write their own history and develop their own way of advocacy. And so we've learned a lot of the dark side of what the British did in places like India and Africa. So, ciao, welcome from Italy. Wonderful, from Venice. The city built on the river, on the sea, really. America needs to end the two-party system. A lot of Americans would agree with you, Cheeseburger. Hello, Gaurav. Welcome. That's an Indian name, if I'm correct. Jade, explain about D. Cooper. Do you mean D.B. Cooper? D.B. Cooper, if I'm correct, I don't know a huge amount about him. I was actually going to watch, there's this really good series, I think Lawrence Fishburne hosts it on Disney Plus National from Nat Geo, that talks about historical mysteries, and one of them is D.B. Cooper. So when I get to that historical documentary, I'll be learning a little bit more about him. But if I'm correct, he was an American pilot who disappeared. And we don't know, kind of like the Jimmy Hoffa of Flight. Lemon is asking, Mary Queen of Scots or Queen Elizabeth I, who was the legitimate heir? Well, I think if you are going to consider the fact that Henry VIII was the rightful king of England, it all depends on what your opinion is. Was Henry VII, who defeats Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth Fields and ends the War of the Roses, was he the legitimate heir? I would argue that he is, yes, and if he isn't, he fakes it till he makes it. Marries the daughter of Edward IV, and he's kind of has Lancastrian blood, so he welds the Lancastrians and the Yorkists together, creates the Tudor Rose, the House of Tudor. The War of the Roses, by the way, is the basis for the Game of Thrones, by the way. So if you enjoy those novels, you might enjoy learning about what I'm talking about, the War of the Roses, which I've talked about a lot on this channel. I've got a series about British monarchs where I talk about it in depth. But yeah, so for me, I think that if you consider Henry VII and Henry VIII the correct heirs, which I do in some way, and then you would have to go with Elizabeth, because you've already got a female queen from Henry's line in Mary, and then her sister-in-law wins. And just because Mary Queen of Scots was a Catholic doesn't mean that she should have become the monarch. There was no real definition that a Catholic monarch should be succeeded by another Catholic monarch at that time. So I'm going to go with Elizabeth I. She's also the far more successful and realistic choice, and she is far more diplomatic and far less chaotic than Mary Queen of Scots. Mary Queen of Scots was a strong woman and powerful in many ways, but she was way too easily given to a scandal. She was way too easily manipulated by men in her court and men she was lovers with. And Elizabeth was shrewd enough to avoid all of that hullabaloo by basically saying, I'm never going to marry, and by controlling the men around her rather than being controlled by them. So I would have to say Elizabeth, and I would have to say all of the plots to get rid of Elizabeth were motivated for one reason and one reason only, and that's because she was a Catholic. I mean, she was a Protestant. So, yeah. Yeah, Lemon, I would say Columbus does unlock a trade that we've never seen before and a new system, the triangle trade, the Columbian exchange. And we just have to ask ourselves, is that a good thing? Because just because you're trading with somebody doesn't mean it's a good thing. The Arabs trade with the Africans, but that creates the African slave trade. The Chinese create the Silk Road to fight against warriors who are oppressing them. And that Silk Road is then used by the Mongols to basically conquer all of Asia, or most of it. I don't know what you mean by that, Tony. That doesn't quite make sense. Yeah, Global, you're right. So when we talk about this, we talk about people love things to be simple and easy, but history is not going to let it, and neither am I. The Native Americans were not homogeneous. They had diverse cultures. The Native Americans in Central America were vastly different from the Native Americans in the plains, like the Lakota tribe, and vastly different from the Native Americans in the southern part of America, like of the United States, like the Cherokee or the Seminole, and very different from the Iroquois, who I just talked about. And of course, that is not to talk about the Aboriginals in Canada, the First Nations people. How are we going to address them and bring them into the mix? So you've got very different tribes who do very different things. Some of them have concepts of land. Some of them build cities. Some of them practice human sacrifice. Some of them are pacifists. Some of them are kind of that new age hippie version, the peaceful savage idea that we get from a lot of people. Some of them were, and those who were often peaceful were often oppressed by those who were not so peaceful. So the Native Americans were not all homogeneous or the same. Their technology, something that is homogeneous, that is unfortunately used to oppress them and to justify their oppression, is that their homogeneity only kind of seems, at least in the United States and Canada, to be that they were not technologically developed in the sense of having the wheel, having organized writings, things like that. But that doesn't mean, but that's not necessarily true. I wouldn't say that. So. Trivet Gun is asking, what influence did the cult of the goddess Nashin have on social justice and redistribution practices in the city-state of Lagash during the early dynastic period of Sumer? I don't know. I'm going to have to look into that, but that is very specific. Nanshi. I've heard of that goddess before. Most of the gods were male, but there were a lot of female gods, and there's a lot of important gods in that area that are kind of just worshipped everywhere you go. Marduk is obviously the one who emerges as kind of the head god of both the Babylonians and the Achaemenid Persian Empire later on. So I don't know a huge amount, but yeah. Lucas is saying, trying to be reasonable will always piss people off. Yes, and that's what I'm here for. And I've had people say horrible things about me. I've had people call me a right-wing nut job and a left-wing conspiracy theorist. And that must mean that I'm doing something right because I'm being somewhat objective. Thank you, John. I really appreciate that. Thank you, Charles. Global's asking a great question, and this is as personal as I get on the channel. Has your interpretation of history changed in your lifetime? I think that's maybe the best question I've had in a long time, and I think it certainly has. So I think there's a lot of historical things that people are taught early on, especially being an American. I was taught the certain things about Columbus that turned out not to be true. Obviously, I talked about that before, and a lot of things I've heard, like, people celebrating George Washington, celebrate him not knowing who he was. And there is reason to celebrate George Washington, in my opinion, but that doesn't mean that just celebrate George Washington because he was the first president. Isn't he a great guy? And he had wooden teeth. No, he had teeth that were made from ivory and perhaps slave bone. And we need to talk about that. There's a way. It's kind of like going over that hump, that meme. George Washington was a good president. No, George Washington was awful and oppressed people. And then on the other side, George Washington was a good president. You kind of go through that, at least I did with George Washington, for example, where it's like, yeah, there's things here that are not great about him, but there's things about me that aren't great. And so I don't want to be judged in 200 years as some sort of racist bigot because of the way I believe, but the vast majority of people in the 1700s, if we met them today, would be racist bigots by that definition. So we need to understand people being victims of their time, living in a particular context, and as I was taught, history is a foreign country. The past is a foreign country. So when you go there, the customs, the beliefs, and the traditions and the languages are all different. So my interpretation has changed. I've looked at certain historical events one way and changed them to think about them another way. A great example of this that I've done recently is looking at the World War II as mutual using rather than the Allies. That the British, the Americans, and the Russians were all kind of using each other at different times for their existential survival, particularly the Soviet Union. So that's something that's been changing just recently. So, Global, I don't know. We'll see. I'll let you know when I run out of space. There's a lot I don't know about. I mean, I have friends who are physicists who are just some of the most brilliant and intelligent people I've ever met. And I go out to dinner with them and we'll talk about something that we all know about. Then they'll start talking about physics amongst themselves. And I have to sit there with my mouth agape a little bit because I just don't know enough about it to comment on it. And if we're talking about George Washington, one thing I do admire about Washington as a president and as a leader is Washington. What made Washington a great leader is what makes anyone a great leader. Washington knew what he didn't know. So it's one thing to know what you know. Everybody knows what they know. But Washington didn't pretend that he knew something, that he didn't know something. Washington wasn't going to say, I am a great speechwriter or I'm this kind of person. No, Washington knew he wasn't an economist, so he trusted Alexander Hamilton to create the national banking system. He knew he wasn't an expert on foreign affairs, so he relied on Thomas Jefferson for that. He knew he wasn't a great writer, so when it came time to write the Constitution, despite being in charge of the whole darn convention, he trusted fellow Virginian James Madison to do most of the writing of it, which is why Washington is called the father of the country and Madison is called the father of the Constitution. So I know what I don't know, And I don't know physics, so that's why this is not a physics Q&A. This is a history Q&A. And if you are enjoying learning about history, like and subscribe, and you will join the growing army of friendly neighborhood historians. But don't worry, we're a totally peaceful army. Army in the most peaceful way possible. I don't know what that is. Hello, Nimar, welcome. I heard round Earth theory is a modern one. It started as an insult, like, well, you believe the Earth was flat not that long ago, so why do you trust? Or yeah, flat Earth theory is basically insulting, and it has a lot of some. I'm not saying no one in the world believed it before recent memory, when conspiracy theorists kind of decided to put on tinfoil hats and start calculating about it. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that educated people throughout history have known the Earth is round. Archimedes was able to figure it out just by looking at shadows and putting a stick in the ground. Hello, welcome. Thank you for joining us. I don't know how to pronounce your title, but you're saying hello again. I wanted to ask you, in your opinion, what is the biggest crime in history? Oh, wow. I think the Holocaust, should obviously come to the front of everyone's mind when they consider the biggest crimes. I think Mao's Great Leap Forward, Stalin's Holodomor. When you have just systematic killings of tens of millions of people, Stalin actually accurately said the death of one man is a tragedy, the death of a million is a statistic. You can't fathom the numbers. That's how bad Mao's genocides, Hitler's genocide, and Stalin's genocides are. I think and it's strange that despite all the technological and supposed political and religious developments from the 19th and 18th century, by the 20th century, that's what we're left with. So that's a good question, but it's a tough one, and it's hard to deal with. So I think those are some of the biggest crimes. When you talk about the mass extinction of people just because they're in your way, or just because you think they're in your way and there's no good reason to do it, that's what you get. You kill off 11 million people just because of their race, ethnicity, and sexuality and political beliefs. That's a crime. That's a huge crime. So, Comedy Scenes is asking how China occupied Tibet. China basically went in there. It's been a contested area for a long time, and then I believe it was the late 50s or maybe the early 60s. China just went in and said, "This is our." It was the late 50s. Mao and the Chinese, in a move of communist expansionism, because communism at its heart is an expansionist idea, went in and said, "This is ours now." And India has chafed under that and has wanted Tibet to be freed for a long time. And of course, there's the Tibetan Buddhists, the Dalai Lama. There's been this movement for freedom in Tibet for a long, long time, and it's not going anywhere, unfortunately. So that's just a quick thing. I don't know a huge amount about it, but yeah. Yes, Simon is pointing out something great. He said, the Earth is clearly round. We are a free speech channel, but not entertaining delusions. Please stick to historical questions, even about the flat Earth theory. Thanks. Yeah, I will say this, as I've said many times, people say crazy stuff in the chat all the time, and I'm lucky I have great moderators like Matt and Simon the Bunny and Rodolfo to clear out all of the crap and the gunk that comes in. But people have come onto the channel and said absolutely awful things, both on videos. They've made fun of me personally, and I just kind of roll it off because I'm going to do what Taylor Swift did and shake it off. But the bigger point is, I believe that it's better to have bad ideas out in the open so that people can condemn them and show how wrong they are, rather than suppressing them. I'm kind of in the Elon Musk camp of free speech absolutism when it comes to that point. So yes, we need to focus on the historical side of that, and that's what I've talked about. I don't know the history of the flat Earth theory in the modern sense, but I know how absurd it is. What were the social consequences of the 1913 Great Mississippi Flood? I don't know a huge amount. I believe so. In the if I'm correct, if I'm thinking about it correctly from what I do know about it and what I have heard about it, and this has been my educated guess to some extent, Trivet Gun, the Great Mississippi Flood contributed greatly to the migration of African Americans who saw their farms and their sharecropping farms destroyed. Their migration to the north, which was common in the 1910s. It's called the Great Migration, where African Americans, something people don't always notice, a historical trend, is that despite the fact that Black Americans were enslaved and freed in the South and lived in the South, places like Detroit, Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., New York City, and Chicago all have large African American populations. Well, how did that happen when those places are in the North and really didn't have slaves? Well, because, or at least got rid of slavery before the Civil War. Well, and there were millions of slaves living in the South who were freed. Well, that's because black Americans in the 1910s and 20s did the Great Migration, where they moved north to avoid racism, or at least avert segregation. There was still a lot of discrimination and hate and racial animosity and malice and hatred. But they moved to the north in order to find new jobs and better opportunities. They were tired of the sharecropping system. They felt that they could have new economic rights and create new neighborhoods like they did in Harlem in the 1920s, the Harlem Renaissance. And so I believe that the Mississippi flood is probably part of the reason why that migration to the north happens. You have African Americans looking for new opportunities in a little bit of a more tolerant climate and a much more industrious one. The reason the North won the Civil War 50 years before that was because the North was far more industrious and far more developed technologically. There were far more economic opportunities for African Americans in Harlem in the 1920s, even if it involved selling their land and leaving their ancestral homelands and farms. And that is how you get large black populations in places like Detroit, the Motor City, of course, Motown. You get the development of Chicago. Of course, Barack Obama is from Chicago, things like that. Although his family isn't ancestrally from there. But point being, why are there large black populations in northern cities? Well, that's because of the Great Migration. It's because of events like the Great Mississippi Flood. It's because of the Klan. It's because of the fear of Jim Crow, which wasn't completely evaporated in the North, but racial hostility was far less of an existential threat to blacks in the North. So, Magic saying the Europeans are the biggest bullies. I think that this is so that's something that historically my interpretation has changed a little bit. I used to historically, I would have agreed with you maybe a few years ago, but my summation, my theory about it is that the Europeans are the biggest bullies only because, I would agree with you, Magic, but only because of technology, not because they are inherently worse or inherently more greedy or evil. That's the same mistake as saying that people are more because they are this. That is the same racist mistake, in my opinion. The Europeans have been the biggest bullies in history because the technology allowed them to go to other continents and be bullies to each other, be bullies to those peoples, be they natives or blacks or Latin peoples. That is not so. That does not mean that you look at history and you look at the trends. People are often bullies to each other in their local areas. I was just seeing something about how the Koreans had the longest chain of unbroken line of slavery when they were enslaving their own people. And the Europeans have been oppressing and killing each other for a long time. The Africans, the natives had all been doing it. The Middle Easterners, same thing, the Arabs. And yet it was the technology of the West that allowed them to create the North, Central, and South America, and use their technology to oppress other people and to extract from them, something they had already been doing. So I hope that settles it, Magic. I do agree with you to some extent. Thank you, Jade. I really appreciate that. And I would love, and I'm not really teaching right now, but you are a wonderful student. Sergio's saying, do you think there was an advanced civilization with today's technology, but most technology was lost by recycling or decay by war? I've heard theories about this. People have wondered about some of the creations in the world, the pyramids, the ziggurats in Mesopotamia, the pyramids in China, the pyramids in Africa, the pyramids in South America, places like Baalbek and the Easter Island Head, Stonehenge, these huge, huge edifices that almost seem impossible for human beings to build. I'm not sure. I don't see enough historical evidence for it as a historian to say it is there. Serpico is asking about one of the best topics ever, the Salem witch trials. So, the Salem witch trials are one of the most bloated historical events, in my opinion, and they're really cool. And I'm glad you're bringing this up because it's right before Halloween, and it's kind of a spooky thing. There were no witches in Salem. There were 21 people who were killed probably because of fear. Literally witch hunting, where you accuse someone of something just because you hate them or you are afraid of them or you are just seeing the devil everywhere or some combination of all three. A lot of people talk about the Salem witch trials as, oh my God, the Salem witch trials. Yes, they were awful, and the witch hunting part of it was terrible. Look at Nathaniel Hawthorne and his writing as he seeks to kind of expedite the spirits from those accusations. But actually the truth of the matter is that the Salem witch trials, 21 people died, which is 21 too many. Of course it is. And it was actually an example of white settlers being able to blame natives. There was a native woman, I'm trying to remember her name, Tituba or something, and they blamed her for worshiping the devil and giving these girls who had epilepsy, most likely demons, where they were shaking and convulsing on the ground, and the people didn't know it was epilepsy, so they thought it was demons, and that led to the beginning of the witch trials. And that woman was killed. A lot of people would confess under heavy inquisition, perhaps even torment. So it was an awful time. It was a very fearful time to be alive. Eventually, the Massachusetts uh, colonial government had to step in and put down because it was so out of hand. But I will say that the Salem witch trials were not that different from what was happening in Europe at the time, where you had a lot of people falsely accused of witchcraft and were killed at a much greater pace. So the New England settlers, the Puritans, strong Christians and Calvinists and Protestants, brought those traditions back from Europe. Europeans have been worried for centuries about witchcraft. So it's not something new. But you have these couple of girls, I forget their names, they have these convulsions and they're shaking on the ground and nobody knows what caused it and they think it's a demon. And the girls rat out this elderly native woman, Tituba, who was a maid, and she is blamed for it and she is hung. And a bunch of people are hung. One guy is actually, Giles Corey was his name, and I remember it because of how he died. They actually, instead of hanging him or burning him at the stake, which was common for witches, as a warlock, he was actually killed by being laid on the ground, having a plank put on him, and being crushed to death by stones. So it was brutal. It was an awful thing. And it just shows the fear of the devil in all places, those who wanted to use it as a way to get rid of their enemies and take their land, those who used it for personal self-enrichment. There was a sheriff who would actually seize the goods and possessions of the people that he arrested and made sure were convicted of witchcraft. Yeah, so anyways, that's a little bit about the Salem witch trials there. And so there was personal aggrandizement, there was this way of being afraid of the devil and manipulating people's fears, and maybe there was some combination of it. A lot of people think it's one thing or the other in history, and oftentimes there's a combination. No Comedy, I do not know that book, but I would like to read it because the Dalai Lama, obviously, Nobel, if I'm correct, the Nobel Prize winner, a very important person. Okay, did I say yesterday that China was the wealthiest nation in the world? Well, technically, the United States right now is the wealthiest nation in the world, but China in history has had the most wealth, and India has always been kind of close in that. Just the same with their populations. India just passed up China for having more people, interestingly enough. Yeah, there's that too, global. There's a lot of fear of women and women empowerment in that very patriarchal society. Thank you. Welcome from Nigeria. Great to have you here. Just going through the chats right now. So, let me see here. Yeah, they didn't have the option for the medicines that would cure epilepsy or take care of it. Yeah. I'm trying to answer as many as I possibly can. Simon is doing a great job moderating and making sure the chat is behaving itself, and we're doing pretty well. And we're about an hour in. We're going to wrap up in a couple minutes. Yes, the Puritans were very strict. Let's see. Is the question? Yeah. Please, if asking, please stick to short AMAs or ask a question on one of his videos if related. Yes, I really like that, Simon. I'm trying to do more longer form content videos, but I have a lot of shorts. I'm doing a current series on powerful women rulers, so I'm doing one tonight. I'm trying to remember who I'm doing it on, but I do that a few times a week. I try to do at least one historical meme reaction, historical myth, and historical did you know about history video at least once a week, sometimes more if I can. And I've got the daily content dropping. Of course, I'm working full time, so it's not easy to produce as much as I want, but hopefully one day I'll be producing as much as I want because this will be my work. So yeah, thank you, Simon, for moderating. You guys should all give Simon a lot of credit and a round of applause. He's done a great job. Flag is asking, are you or would you be a politician? I've had people tell me that I could be. I don't want to be because politicians, in my opinion, are people who want to give the quick answers to difficult problems. And as a historian, I know that anytime that happens, that's not good, and that often leads to demagoguery. So I'll take that as a compliment about something about me. But no, I'm not particularly interested in being a politician. Donatus, I love that name, by the way. is asking, I am very interested in British history from 1485 when Henry VII ascended the throne. We were just talking about the War of the Roses. So basically, here's what happens, and I'll set it up this way. In the French and the British have been fighting, English have been fighting a war for 100 years called the 100 Years' War. What a war. And the English were doing really poorly under King Henry VI. Henry VI had bouts of mental illness. He was not really stable, and he wasn't really a good ruler, and he kind of relied on his wife. So his wife was kind of calling the shots. One of his nobles, Richard of York, really didn't like this. And Richard, interestingly enough, was the Duke of York, believe it or not. And so Richard comprised a war, civil war. There's been several civil wars in English history. This is the most bloody. There's actually an English civil war, as it's called, in the 1600s, but more about that later. So Richard devises this war against Margaret, Henry's wife, and they fight for years. And Richard dies, but his son, Edward, is able to supplant Henry in 1461, and he's able to become the King of England. And he creates the York family, which I believe this is why the reason it's called the War of the Roses, I mentioned earlier. The Lancastrians, who were Henry's family, were represented by the Red Rose, and the Yorkists were represented by the White Rose. I might have had those mixed up. But anyways, Edward is able to become king, and Henry is kind of driven into exile with his wife, who keeps fighting. And eventually they're able to take the throne back for a little bit, but then Henry is overthrown again by Edward in 1471, and Edward makes short work of him. Edward spends the rest of his reign consolidating his power. He is one of the first English kings, interestingly enough, to marry for love. He marries Elizabeth Woodville, who really has no political power to give him, but she loves him and he loves her, which is unspeakable in that time. You married for political gain or economic advantage. You didn't marry for love. How dare you? But anyways, so Edward IV spends most of the rest of his reign, after overthrowing the Lancastrians, supplementing Yorkist power and building a power base for his son. However, he dies young, and his son Edward V, is too young to rule on his own. So him and his brother Richard are put under the care of their regent, who will kind of govern for them until they're old enough. This is common in European history. Their regent is one of the most notorious English kings in history, one of the most notorious monarchs. Obviously, Shakespeare made him even worse than he probably was, the hunchbacked Richard III. So Richard, by the way, the Duke of York is the second in line to the British throne because of a War of the Roses. Right now, William is the Prince of Wales. That is the heir to the British throne. So when Charles dies, William will assumingly become the next king of England. But Harry, if I'm correct, Harry, his brother, is the Duke of York because he is he is next in line. Anyways, enough of that sidebar. So Edward V is too young to rule, so their uncle Richard, who I think it was the Duke of Gloucestershire, which is another high-ranking duchy in England at that time, he puts them under his care in the Tower of London, and he probably starves them to death. And this makes him extremely unpopular. They die, and nobody has ever found them, and rumors have been that their ghosts have haunted the Tower of London for a long time. And Richard is all of a sudden King Richard III, out of nowhere. What a shocking revelation. So Richard is obviously very hated for doing this, and he sees one upstart, the son of the illegitimate son, descendant of a Lancastrian, Owen Tudor, his son Henry Tudor, who is Welsh, not English, raises an army and lands, and I forget exactly where he lands, but they meet at the Battle of Bosworth Fields, and Richard thinks this will be an easy victory, but Henry has amassed a large army, and he is able to defeat Richard. Richard is killed at the battle, and Henry is given Richard's crown from his dead body, and he becomes Henry VII. Now, there's a lot of questions about him being an actual heir to the throne, and rather than just a usurper. And he's going to deal with usurpers like Perkin Warbeck throughout his reign. But in 1485, he defeats Richard and kills him at the Battle of Bosworth Fields. And in order to consolidate his power and to prove to the English people that he is legitimate, he decides to make peace between the Lancastrians and the Yorkists. He will not be a Lancastrian king, despite his bloodline being somewhat tied to the Lancastrians. He marries Edward IV's daughter. I'm trying to remember her name. Extremely important queen. I think her name was Margaret as well. And she's going to be extremely important in creating his royal stability, his royal court, and establishing his power and legitimizing his throne. And Henry becomes Henry VII. And basically, he spends the rest of his reign doing everything he can to hold on to his power and legitimize his throne. And he will do this as well as his son, England's most well-known monarch, Henry VIII. But basically, Henry VII ascends the throne in violence. In Battle of Bosworth Field, by the way, is the most violent battle in English history. He marries the daughter of Edward IV in order to assuage his enemies and to assert his dominance, and he spends the rest of his reign dealing with usurpers, consolidating power, and basically being a cheapskate so that England can become wealthy. But he actually turns out to be a pretty effective king. So he went from being from a bastard line that really had no claim to the English throne to uniting the Lancastrians and the Yorkists by being a Lancastrian who marries a Yorkist because love conquers all, or power and violence conquers all. Probably better for those people. He also mixes the red and white rose into the symbol of a new family that he calls the Tudors, because his father's surname. So that's the creation of the Tudor dynasty and the end of the War of the Roses in both the Lancastrian and Yorkist feud. Yakahakra is asking, do you know which natives settled in North Carolina? We're almost done. I'm going to wrap up in a minute, but trying to remember the tribes. I think the Creek, maybe the Chickasaw. I don't know all of that. I'm thinking also the Crow. Tin Man is saying, hello, welcome. Yes, global, that's true. Canada does include the natives, the USA does not. And part of that, I think, global, is because Canada actually gets its constitution much later, when the entire domain has been, as the British would call it, has been kind of occupied. And so you have these Aboriginal First People nations who are kind of, the entire land is kind of already settled. The United States Constitution is created when there's really not that much. The United States does not hold that much land, does not hold nearly what, not even half of what it will hold by the end of doesn't hold half of what it will hold by the end of by the beginning of the 19th century, and is far from what the continental United States have become. So the natives, it doesn't oversee as wide a range of land and native tribes in those lands because of that. But of course, there are natives living in the 13 colonies who get shafted, and in the Ohio River Valley, America's territory it won from the British in the American Revolution, who also will get shafted. So that's true. So yeah, like and subscribe. We're trying to get to 6,000. I'm going to wrap up soon. The Cherokee are in North Carolina. That's definitely true. Good morning. Welcome. Good to see you again. Yep. It is nasty. But nobody knows if it's true, Bex. That's a rumor, but it's probably more true than the wooden teeth, the wooden dentures thing. Because in all actuality, Washington probably had, it was ivory, and there was a dentist for Washington who was known for ordering and using slave bones in his fake teeth. So who knows if that included Washington or not. So we don't actually know. So, anyways. Yeah, Tin Man, you're right. You don't hear much about the Barbary Wars, which was where the United States' first real war and conflict, where they put down the Barbary Coast pirates who had been assaulting and kidnapping European traders for years and actually enslaving white Europeans, believe it or not, in North Africa. Yeah, I think I'm catching up. Could you elaborate on the Great Emu War of 1932? Terrific Gun, if I'm correct, that's in Australia. I don't know much about it, but it's really, really funny. There are some wars that are started by animals. I don't know a lot about it. Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, Michael, I agree. Washington does do that, although he's far from perfect. Yep, Bex, they did discover it was round. I'm kind of going fast mode just to wrap it up because I want to get to as many questions as possible. Yeah, that's true. What am I wrong about? The British Raj. Yeah, are you talking about how the British used different Indian rulers against each other? Because yes, that was pretty awful too, basically pitting them against each other. The British also created the concentration camp. The Belgian, and a huge crime was that the Belgians did in Africa and the Belgian Congo, under their emperor Leopold, they would actually, if children did not want to work in the rubber and diamond mines, they would actually cut off their hand. And it's awful. What do I think of Israel and Palestine? I think the war needs to end soon. Yes, I agree with you, Flag. There's a lot of crimes happening right now that people don't talk about, and there's actually 10 million slaves in Africa today that we do not talk about. Yeah, Judy, that's amazing. Yeah, Thailand is one of the very few countries that did not have colonization, and it basically was able to kind of pit different empires against each other, be they the Mongols or the Indians. or even the Japanese during World War II and not be taken over. I think the year without the summer is, I think in the 1800s when there was the little ice age caused, and there was a volcanic eruption mixed with a little ice age, and basically it was dark for months throughout Europe. I think it was 1815. It's actually when Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein, if I'm correct. There were slaves who escaped to the north. That's true. There were African Americans living in the north. There were freed blacks in the north. That's what 12 Years a Slave is about throughout American history. But the large majority of African Americans who moved to the north in the 20th century, especially in the beginning. Thank you for saying that. Good day. Welcome. Okay, let's see. I'm going kind of fast so I can see everything. Hello from Scotland. Welcome, Fraser. Thank you for subscribing. Let me see. Still going through this. Wow, I didn't know I'd love history this much. I think it's the key how one's talking about history. Yes, Flag. It's absolutely true. History is that subject that's boring and dates and dead people in schools, and I just don't know why, because it's just so daggone fascinating. If people would treat it more like a story and look at the human condition and how that's exposed, I think we would be a lot better off. Yes, Bex, they definitely were, and that was the case with the Salem witch trials. They would definitely, you do see Tourette's and other tics, maybe even a prototype of ADHD being mistaken that way. Yeah, that's partly true, Global, about people coming to this country, to the United States, I should say. Well, Diana, I'm glad you're reaching out, and if you like what you're learning about, and you are you've been able to pick my mind for however long you've been here, like and subscribe. If you guys like and subscribe, you are officially a friendly neighborhood historian. It's as easy as that. I really appreciate all of you guys joining, and Guns, Germs, and Steel. I'll have to look it up. Thank you for joining us. Really appreciate it. Am I reading straight from, crashing it? I'm glad you kept this one, Simon, and didn't censor it. Are you reading straight from Wikipedia? No. No. Because if I was in charge of Wikipedia, a lot of things would change overnight. Hello, or should I say bonjour? Bex is asking, do you know about the past conflict between Greece and Turkey and why they dislike each other so much? It's not one past conflict, it's several different wars the Greeks and the Turks fought, especially because the Ottoman Turks conquered Greece and controlled it for centuries, while Greece was still originally had been part of the Byzantine Eastern Roman Empire, conquered by the Ottomans in the 15th century, and for a long time would chafe under that, and then in the 1830s got its independence after a long struggle. 1832 is when the Greeks, in the wave of nationalism that was common in Europe at the time, got their independence, the first Balkan state to go free of the Ottomans, and the first sign of Ottoman decline. But yeah, fighting the Ottoman Empire, trying to get their own freedom. Several different wars happened in the Balkans where the Greeks were trying to get different areas throughout the 19th century, and the Greeks and the Turks absolutely hate each other for that in many ways. I didn't know that, Ian. I don't know what you're talking about. Mr. McKinnon is saying, yes, you do not have to care about England until the United States does something for England, in which case you do have to care about it, because at this point, history is all connected, and if we fail to learn from history, we will repeat it. Yeah. Yeah, I'm going to thank you for coming, Jacob. I really appreciate it. I'm glad to hear that. I really appreciate everybody coming and asking such great questions. You are right. Otter, thank you for joining us. Hello, welcome. And you're from India. Welcome. Another great person from India. Yeah. Well, I will take one more question. We'll do our last call right now. We've gone about 15 minutes over, but it's been really wonderful to talk to all of you. And we weren't that late starting off with, Simon. I must say, we weren't that late. Yeah, I understand why he does, and I understand why Greeks dislike Turks. There's a lot of cultural and ethnic animosity because of history. And if people learn about history, they can understand it. And yes, Otter, of course, you're always here with the very last question, or it seems like that, but I appreciate that. That's a great question. Why is John Adams so underrated? This is the last question, guys, so I'll give this answer and then we'll sign off. But I think he's underrated because he was not a very good president. I think Washington was a great president. I think Jefferson was a great president. I think James Madison was a good enough president that people love to talk about them and what they did. Ben Franklin is obviously this amazing inventor. He's just this metropolitan Renaissance man. But John Adams is underrated because despite all he did, helping write the Declaration of Independence, he's the one that recommended Washington to lead the American Army and Jefferson to write the Declaration of Independence. How amazing is that? Because Adams' presidency was kind of blasé and weak and he only got elected to one term, he's kind of overwritten because he's not the good-looking, tall George Washington, because he's not the intellectual, brilliant mind of Jefferson or Franklin. He kind of gets overwhelmed. But he's the only one of the men that I just mentioned who didn't own slaves. He fought hard to end slavery. He was quintessential. He was quintessential in the Boston Massacre and afterwards. He created the American Navy when he was president, probably his greatest accomplishment. And yes, he failed with the Alien and Sedition Acts, where he kind of crushed free speech and censored the press that was against him. But he wasn't a horrible president in retrospect. He just wasn't an extremely successful one. And I think that's why we kind of shaft him. So, oh, I'm sorry, Taylor. I'm glad you're here. And last question. Okay, who was the best president ever? Oh, I'm going to go with Lincoln because that one just seems like an obvious one. All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. I really appreciate all of you joining. If you really like learning about history, like and subscribe. And you will be a friendly neighborhood historian. It's as easy as that. Remember, next week we are doing 3 live streams, guys. We're going to try it out and see where we can get. Friday evening at some point, Saturday evening at some point, and Sunday at our regular time. But Sunday will, from now on, be where we talk to you guys just about topics that I'm interested in. So save your questions for Friday and Saturday, and hopefully I will see you guys then. Have a great week and take care, and I'll see you in channel. Like, subscribe, check out my daily content, short videos, long videos, all of that stuff. Thank you, Melinda. I really appreciate that. You are so sweet. And we are on the way to the Legion thanks to you guys. Have a great day and take care. Godspeed.